crime. In other words, it was hateful for this female security guard to remove this man out of the restroom because she perceived him as a threat, as an affront. He says that he was emotionally traumatized by the incident. Do we care if women and children are emotionally traumatized by men going into the restrooms because they feel like it? We don't care about the vast majority of people. No, for this transgender tyranny, we are going to let the small minority lord it over everyone else. And he says, the security guard told him, "You guys cannot keep coming in here and using our women's restroom. They did not pass the law yet." See, that's the problem. They really don't care what women and young girls believe about this, how they feel about this. They don't want to protect them or even have any concern about their emotional trauma about this. All right, stay with us when we come back from break. Jakari Jackson has a special report on sex trafficking, and we're going to cover what's being called the gun apocalypse in California, sweeping regulations that will control even ammunition. Maybe we should call it Ammogeddon. We'll be right back.
It seems like every day there's a new story about exploitation of human beings. Oftentimes these are sexual in nature and include things like forced prostitution. They also include things like forced labor, slavery. And with more on this, here's my conversation with Laramie Gorbett of the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault.
Well, my job is to provide training and technical assistance in the area of human trafficking and sexual assault. So I do a lot of training with law enforcement. We do lots of trainings with Homeland Security, and specifically how to identify victims of trafficking. A big part of the training is identifying the difference between smuggling and trafficking and the vulnerabilities of people who are smuggled and how they are likely to be eventually victims of trafficking. We do training on trauma-informed investigations, so how you actually are able to investigate and interview victims from a trauma/victim-centered perspective so that you are not re-traumatizing the victim or the survivor.
Can you define that distinction between human trafficking and smuggling?
Sure. Smuggling is a crime against a nation, against a sovereign nation or a border. Human trafficking is a crime against a person. It's a human rights or a civil rights violation. When you look at human trafficking, there are several different components. You have domestic minor trafficking, which could be labor trafficking or sex trafficking, and then you have international trafficking, which could be sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And there are many different subcategories, including forced prostitution, commercially exploited children, etc. There are far more victims of trafficking than are being identified, but that's one of the jobs that we have, is to go and to do these trainings to specifically to look for victim indicators that somebody has been a victim of force, fraud, and coercion. And a lot of times is, do they have access to their own documents? Do they have their passport? Do they have ID? Do they have access to money? Do they have keys? Where are they staying? Are they kept all in one area? Do they live where they work? Are there signs of physical abuse, torture, cigarette burns, broken bones, bruises? Are they free to leave, to come and go? These are just some of the basic indicators. If somebody is trying to discern whether or not this is a smuggling situation or whether this is a trafficking situation. And somebody who's experienced complex trauma, somebody that's been physically abused, sexually abused, either prior to being trafficked or as a direct result of being trafficked, they don't just come forward with that information. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that's very difficult for law enforcement, because they're trying to get information to do their job, to put the bad guys away. And with somebody's experienced trauma, you don't just come forward with that information. That's not just an easy thing to say, especially when you've been threatened. You say, if you tell anybody what's happening here, then this is going to happen to you, or this is going to happen to your family. And so that's where the complexities come, of being able to establish a rapport with the victim, being able to establish services for them where they have their medical needs addressed, where they have food, water, shelter, and feel safe, that they can then kind of disclose some of the things that happen to them for the investigation, but also for their own well-being. And that's one of the things that we do is when we have these trainings, kind of connecting the dots with law enforcement, with the people investigating these cases, and the rape crisis centers, the domestic violence shelters that will then come in to provide those services. And it's not easy. If you're trying to have a conversation with somebody and their abuser, their trafficker, their enforcer is right over here, are they going to be able to do that? No. If they haven't eaten in 3 days, if they are wearing dirty underwear and have been chained to a bed for a week at a time, is that a situation where they're going to feel physically comfortable and emotionally comfortable enough to open up? No. And so that's one of the difficult things about conducting these interviews. Are they in a safe place? Have they had a chance to eat? Have they had a chance to sleep? Have they been given clothes? Are you even speaking their language? And still breaking them those barriers of fear and distrust, which those are survival mechanisms. That's what's kept them alive to this point. And so being able to collaborate with people who have training in trauma-informed care and understand about what happens to you physically and emotionally and neurologically when you experience complex trauma. And so having those things kind of set up ahead of time makes a really big difference. And even having a place to go. Because if you take a victim of trauma and you put them in an interrogation room, then they're going to feel like criminals. And they're already scared. And, you know, it's already in a situation that is unfamiliar to them, and a situation that would be alarming to most people, let alone somebody that's experienced this kind of violence. So those are just all things to keep in mind, and things still have to happen. You know, people still do their investigations and they're trying to get the information, and a lot of times people are in time crunch. And it's one of the reasons why this is so complex.
For those who participate in the activities, for the people who are driving up the demand, in your personal opinion, are there stiff enough penalties legally?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, if we talk about, you know, domestic minor sex trafficking, or we talk about domestic sex trafficking in general, a lot of times victims are treated like criminals. And even the language that people use, whether it's law enforcement or the media, when you talk about a 14-year-old prostitute, there are no 14-year-old prostitutes. 14-year-olds can't legally consent to sex. They're actually victims of trafficking. They are commercially exploited children. They are victims of child abuse or sexual assault. There's no 14-year-old prostitute. And so the way that we talk about victims of trafficking, the way that we talk about prostitutes, you know, that's problematic in and of itself, but also how they're treated as far as are they arrested for prostitution? Are they charged? Are they given access to resources and counseling and emergency housing and crisis intervention and all of that? And then what happens to the Johns, the people that are buying the sex? And in a lot of cases, it's considered a misdemeanor to buy sex from an adult. So addressing the demand can happen through laws, but it also happens through changing the way we think about women, about children, about sex and gender, and not adhering to a value system where you automatically think of a woman or a child as a sexual object. So, I mean, and that's far more complex and a lot bigger conversation. But that's one part of it. So yes, laws that affect actually paying for sex is one thing, but also having a mentality of where you are seeing the value of humans outside of their potential for profit. There are a lot of resources available. We always need more, but there are a lot of resources out there. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is a great resource for parents, for educators, for teens to find out specifically about the vulnerabilities of children being exploited sexually. It's also, they partner with law enforcement and the FBI to connect missing children along with children that are being exploited sexually online. So that is a good resource, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Also, the Polaris Project is an organization that provides a lot of data specifically on trafficking, labor trafficking, and sex trafficking. Locally, there is the Central Texas Coalition Against Human Trafficking that meets here in Austin, that's made up of law enforcement, social service providers, faith-based and community-based organizations coming together to talk about what's happening in the field. Also, there's Allies Against Slavery that's here in Austin, and Refugee Services of Texas is one of the other points of contact as far as providing direct services to survivors of trafficking.
Well, the New York Times points out that there is a fight going on in California between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. A big fight as to who's going to win there, because Bernie believes that he's going to be able to make the case for superdelegates to switch to him if he can pull off a big win in California. Well, good luck with that. But the presidential race draws attention to the fact that there really is an arms race going on in California right now. And that's a race to take away our arms. It's a race between the president of the Senate and the current lieutenant governor, who both want to become the next Democrat governor. So they are trying to show their bona fides in terms of gun control measures there. And that is a slight difference between Bernie and Hillary. Bernie has a D- from the NRA, but even Bernie Sanders will not hold parties responsible for things that were crimes that were committed with guns, like gun manufacturers and even movie theaters, like Hillary Clinton wants to do. Remember, it was just this last week that a court found that victims of the Aurora, Colorado shooting, where there was the Dark Knight showing, could not be held, they could not hold Cinemark responsible for the deaths of the people there. Of course, that was an act by a criminal individual. And the theater didn't have anything to do with it. Neither did the makers of the movie, and neither did the makers of the gun. There's even a congressional piece of legislation that makes that clear. Nevertheless, Hillary Clinton would move against that. And we see what's happening in California. We've got now what is being called by guns.com a gun-pocalypse. 11 fast-tracked anti-gun bills sweeping the California Senate, just to get an idea of what's at stake here. Measures to require mandatory registration of ghost guns, guns that you largely manufacture yourself. Retroactive bans on currently grandfathered firearms and magazines going back to 1899, so antiques are going to be banned. They're going to outlaw the use of bullet buttons. That's a device to make sure that you can change your magazine without using special tools. They founded a state-run firearm violence research center, which will create gun control propaganda as if it were a health care issue. They're going to make all gun theft a felony offense. They're going to criminalize loans of guns between friends, and they're going to require the reporting of stolen guns. And I assume that that would be a felony if you don't do that as well. And then there's going to be 3 bills focusing on ammunition alone. They will be bills that will mandate background checks for ammunition purchases, as well as collecting and saving sales tax information when people purchase ammunition. So maybe we ought to call it ammo-geddon. You know, there really isn't much place to look if we're going to look at the Second Amendment. Outside of the Republicans and Democrats, even the person who's being touted as the vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party has supported assault weapon bans. With the Democrat nominees working as hard as they can to take away our gun rights, with even the libertarians soft on the right to keep and bear arms, the NRA endorsed Donald Trump. And we have a special report from Joe Biggs, who is at the NRA convention in Kentucky.
Hey, this is Joe Biggs with INFOWARS.com, and I'm standing here with
Colin Noir.
And you are one of the
sexy and stuff.
yeah. You're one of the faces of the NRA, right?
I guess.
So let's get in a little bit of politics. You know, you know, the NRA came out. They're saying that they've endorsed Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. What do you think about all that?
A bit indifferent, as far as I'm concerned. I'm largely a one-issue voter for the most part. If you're not doing anything that's in contrast to how I feel about the Second Amendment for the most part, then we're in line. I know the people who are adamantly against it, and I know the people who are questioningly for it. So that's kind of where I am right now.
What do you think one of the most important topics in America today is, besides the Second Amendment right now? Something else that you really care a lot about, that you'd like to see taken care of with this next president?
So, of course, the Second Amendment takes such a massive precedence in my life in terms of what stays in my brain for the most part. And you know, there are a bunch of other things that kind of fall into that line as well. You know, I'm really big on the idea of honestly just freedom and not necessarily imparting somebody else's ideas on somebody else,
Yeah.
right? The idea that because I'm not for this, you shouldn't be for this. I think from a 30,000